You're listening to Speaking Sidemount, the podcast where we talk all things sidemount diving, from equipment, skills, techniques, and sidemount diving expeditions to interviews with some of the world's top sidemount divers. Whether you're new to sidemount, been sidemount diving for years, or just want to know more, this is the place for all things sidemount. I'm your host, Steve Davis. Let's get wet. So joining us on the show today is renowned cave explorer, sidemount instructor, and inventor of the Razor sidemount system, Steve Bogaerts. Steve, welcome to Speaking Sidemount.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Hey, before we start, I've got to confess, I've been responsible for thousands of your YouTube views on that skills video that you made with the Yanni music years and years ago. Mm-hmm. I mean, I watched it in awe, and I think as a new diver or someone looking to get into sidemount and looking at the skill set that you presented there, I just thought, I've got to get me some of that. You know, as my wee story alludes, you've been a key player in the immense growth of sidemount over the past 15, 20 years, and I'm really interested in what your thoughts are on how sidemount has evolved from the early days through to today.
Well, I think basically what happened, there was like a perfect storm of a lot of factors all coming together at the same time that caused really the explosion in sidemount diving. One of those things was, I mean, I've been sidemount diving for quite a while before that video came out, or before we started producing some videos on YouTube. At the time, around about 2006, I was doing a lot of exploration, trying to connect Sistema Sakaktoon to Sistema Nahoshna-Chich. I needed better equipment to do that, and that's basically how the Razor evolved out of necessity. And very often, that's exactly how sort of like new things come about, you know, necessity being the mother of invention. At the same time, obviously, social media was taking off, and sort of like having basically developed the Razor for myself and for my own diving that I was doing, I started teaching some of my students in the Razor. One of those students was HP, who later became a business partner. And obviously his interest was also in producing video and everything. And we were just really having fun with it. So he shot some video of me just playing around with sidemount, hence the skills video that has been very popular with many people over the years. And just the fact that now people all over the world could actually see sidemount, could see someone diving sidemount, that it looked fun, that it looked comfortable, that it looked fairly easy to do. I think they were introduced to a technical style of diving that very few people knew about before that time, because obviously it was a niche activity within cave diving. Prior to around about 2008, 2009, the majority of cave divers were diving in backmount. It was only really the cave explorers that were using sidemount as a tool to facilitate their exploration. But after those videos sort of went viral, they went worldwide, and a lot of people all of a sudden thought, wow, that looks really cool. I'd like to try that. And obviously, sidemount is an applicable equipment configuration, not just for overhead environment diving, but also for open water diving as well. And we also made some open water films. There's one in particular which was popular, which was a wreck dive on the Mamavinia. And obviously that got a lot of attention as well. So I think a lot of people all of a sudden sat up and took notice. They saw something they maybe never seen before, and it kind of looked interesting, and they gave it a try themselves, and they found out that they really enjoyed diving that way.
Yeah, it raises an interesting point, because for a long time you've emphasized that sidemount can be used both in overhead and open water environments. But we also see a school of thought where many think that it's just a tool that should only be used for dives that require passing restrictions. I mean, how do you rationalize those two things?
Well, obviously, sidemount started in the cave diving environment. In fact, way back, and in sort of like the early 60s, it was being used as a technique for exploration in caves by the CDG in sumps in the UK. And because of the nature of that type of diving, sidemount was really the only applicable technique that they could use, because logistically it was difficult to get back-mounted cylinders to the dive site, because there's a lot of dry caving involved, and they had to crawl and drag their tanks with them. So it was actually called the English style of cave diving. Whereas if you look at what they were doing in France, where they were diving, you know, in the springs there, and they could actually more or less kit up at the side of the spring and jump straight in, and they were using an independent back-mounted equipment configuration, which was known as the French style. Later on, the Americans adopted the English style. They modified it slightly to do some further exploration in the caves of Florida. But for the first sort of 50 or 60 years just about of its history, Sidemount was really the preserve of cave divers and very much of cave explorers. And outside of that fairly niche community and that fairly small group of divers, no one really knew too much about Sidemount. So no one thought to use it in open water, but there's no reason why it can't or shouldn't be used in open water. Just as rebreather technology for diving started in caves, people don't have a problem with that being used in open water. So if you go back, you look at a lot of the technology or equipment configuration or modification that had its genesis in cave diving, because these are guys who are pushing the limits, they're exploring, they're trying to come up with new ways of doing things. And then that's filtered down through the various levels, through cave diving, through technical diving, into open water diving and even recreational diving. And Sidemount is just another example of that. But there are many others that I could give you, such as a back plate and harness style configuration, or wing style BCD, or a long hose, for example, which came from cave diving. Even the BCD itself originally came from cave diving. The use of closed circuit rebreathers, the use of Sidemount technology. So all of those things originally came from a cave diving environment. Now, to be a purist and say that because Sidemount was born in the cave and therefore can only be used in the cave, seems to me to not really make a lot of sense. It's a very limiting argument. And at the end of the day, if you find an equipment configuration that you're happy with, that's comfortable for you, that you feel safe using, why not use it in an open water environment or as a recreational diver? I see really no issue or problem with that.
Yeah, sure. I tend to agree. And I think especially if you build a significant skill set in one configuration, why would you swap from one to the other unless you've got a really good need to do so? So, I mean, I can understand where some of the back mount divers are coming from, but equally, if you're a trained side mount diver, yeah, why would you switch because you're going to open water? Completely agree. You've linked your name to Bogaerthian side mount configuration. I mean, what does that really mean?
I haven't really linked my name to that. Other people have maybe made that association. Yeah. So obviously going back a little bit in history, back mount configuration sort of like 20 years ago was a little bit of a hodgepodge of different styles, different thoughts and philosophies about how to set up back mount equipment and how to get the most out of it. And William Hogarth Main came up with a very simple, very streamlined way of configuring a back mount setup. And obviously that came again from cave diving. He was an explorer with WKPP, the Wolfville Karst Plains Project. And so as people used that configuration, they discovered that, hey, this works really well. It's clean, it's simple, it's efficient. And that's basically what he was looking for. He was looking for something that was as clean and as efficient as possible because it made his dives more comfortable, more efficient, and easier to perform. And so the same with Sidemount. If you look back sort of like 10 or 15 years with Sidemount, it's a little bit like that Star Wars bar scene. Everyone's sort of doing their own thing. Everyone looks completely different. There's no standardization. The equipment configuration, there's such an incredible variety of things that people are using. And they all work to one extent or another. Perhaps some are a little bit more efficient or effective than others. So one of the things that I did when I sat down and came up with the Razor system was I started with a completely blank page and wrote down a wish list for all the things that I wanted from a side mount system that I was going to design for myself. And obviously the core of that is actually the harness, and then obviously on top of that the BCD, but all of the ancillary equipment. So things like the pouch, for example, how the tanks are set up, how the regulators are set up, they all work together. It's a very holistic approach. The idea being that every single piece of equipment affects every other piece of equipment. And by definition, it will also have an impact on your skills and procedures as well. So it all needed to work together in a very fluid, very efficient and very simple fashion. And that was always my philosophy, and it's always been my philosophy with technical diving, with cave diving, is keep it as simple as possible, because that way you're less likely to make mistakes, it's easier to use, and also less is more. Try not to overdo any type of redundancy. Obviously you need to have sufficient redundancy, but you don't want to overdo it. You don't want to have too much stuff with you, because then you just tend to multiply potential failure points, entanglement hazards, stuff just gets in the way. And it becomes harder to deal with all of your equipment. So for myself, I'm pretty lazy. So if something works really well for me and it's easy to use, then that makes my life easier. In addition to that, I'm not the brightest guy in the world, and as soon as I hit the water, I start losing IQ points, and the deeper I go, the more IQ points I lose. So, if a system is simple, if procedures are simple, if skills are simple, it makes it much easier for me to perform them.
Yep. Yeah, completely understand. And I guess some of the discussions around long hose, short hose, two short hoses, DIR, and donating what you breathe all relate to that as well. And I've seen some really interesting discussions around those and decisions made which then guide the rest of the equipment configuration. What are your thoughts on some of that?
Okay, so I basically think that at the end of the day, first and foremost, we need to look at the environment you're diving in, and we need to base the equipment we're going to use on that environment, but also on the type of diving that you're going to do. So there's no one equipment configuration that's going to work for every single individual in all environments for all particular dives. So you really need to have that first and foremost in your mind. Choose the right equipment for yourself, the dive you're going to do, and in the environment you're actually in. Now, having said that, Sidemount as an equipment configuration works really, really well in pretty much every environment. Now, are there going to be some individual preferences people have to configure their equipment a certain way that they're comfortable with, maybe from previous training, they come from a previous training protocol or previous equipment configuration protocol that makes certain skills more comfortable for them. They're more used to doing them a certain way. So therefore, when they dive Sidemount, they want to have a carryover with those skills because they built up muscle memory. Then that makes total sense. And in fact, when I was designing the Razor system, and as I said, this whole holistic approach to Sidemount and the Razor training program, it was very much bearing in mind that people were coming into Sidemount at that time as experienced technical divers, as experienced cave divers, and they were used to diving a long hose, for example, and diving a short hose as well. And so that was where my thinking came from, that if I could keep the equipment configuration as close as possible to what people were using already, that the skill transfer was actually not that big, and it meant they got up to speed much faster. They were a lot more comfortable, much more quickly. And at the end of the day, it works really well. I had various levels of training. So at the basic Sidemount level, where people are diving in the open water or maybe in the overhead environment, depending on what their current level of certification is, they may be diving either solo or in a team. They may be diving just with other Sidemount divers, or they may be diving in mixed teams with backmount divers or with rebreather divers. Then they need an effective way of being able to share gas with other divers. And the best and easiest way to do that is using a long hose. So again, it made sense to keep the long hose on the right tank, keep the short hose on the left tank, and have a just transfer of skill from what people already knew. Beyond that level of training, at the advanced Sidemount level of training, where people are in true Sidemount cave, then the long hose doesn't actually really confer any advantages to you. In fact, has a number of disadvantages. So at that point, at that higher training level, the long hose is gone, and now you have two short hoses, because you're either diving solo or you're diving with other Sidemount divers. So it's extremely unlikely that you're going to have two catastrophic failures that force you into a gas sharing situation in the first place. If that did happen for whatever reason, and there is still a possibility, however remote, then the easiest way to gas share in this type of environment is actually to pass off a cylinder to another diver so you can remain completely independent. It's very, very difficult to share gas using a long hose if you've got to negotiate through multiple restrictions, which may be longer than the long hose, and maybe you're doing that in zero visibility. Maybe you have to remove and replace equipment while you're doing that. So now a long hose becomes impractical. It's a potential entanglement hazard. It's a potential entrapment hazard. So you're far better off. You're going to be able to move more efficiently. It's going to be safer and simpler actually for the divers to be semi-independent at this point in time. And actually to do a cylinder exchange is a comparatively simple and easy skill to perform, and anyone diving at the advanced Sidemount level should be able to do that comfortably without too much difficulty.
Yeah, it makes a huge amount of sense having the right equipment configuration for the dive you're doing versus, some dogma around, you've got to do it this way all the time. I mean, one thing I find personally, I do a lot of diving with backmount divers and rebreather divers, and it is so easy having a long hose on the right, exactly the same as my DIR backmount divers do. So
just to expand on that a little bit, I think that if you're diving 2 short hoses in the open water with divers who haven't been trained in Sidemount and maybe have no way of accepting a cylinder from you, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. Okay, yes. So just to be able to pass off a long hose to someone is simple. It's something they're familiar with. They've probably practiced and done that at some level in their training, and it's comfortable and easy to do. To dive with 2 long hoses doesn't make a huge amount of sense either, because, I mean, how many people are you actually going to be sharing gas with? Mm-hmm. Okay, so, you know, again, you obviously plan for a worst-case scenario that I'm going to have to hand my long hose off to someone and share gas with them, but I'm not going to have to do that with, you know, more than one diver. The idea that you have to donate the regulator from your mouth in all circumstances, for me, yeah.
I mean, you may have breathed it 2 minutes ago. It's not like a back mount where...
You should be breathing them consistently, right? If you're diving inside mount, you should be pushing from one cylinder to the other consistently throughout the dive. So if you happen to be breathing on the short hose when someone tells you they're out of gas, it's a comparatively simple thing to donate your long hose. It should be on a breakaway connection anyway. It's on a clip, so you could unclip it. You should be able to break it away. And it's very rare that gas sharing emergencies are instantaneous. All of a sudden you get a signal from someone, you turn around and there's someone going, you know, I'm out of gas, and it's a complete surprise to you. In reality, the chances are that you're aware that your partner, your buddy, has an issue and may need to share gas, so you can be prepared ahead of time to start sharing gas with them. Now we come to the argument about 2 medium-length hoses.
Yeah, 2 1-meter hoses, yeah.
Yeah, and so for me, that's not one thing or the other. It means that you've got this extra hose length that you have to manage, you have to deal with. There's a potential for more entanglement hazard. And then having donated that hose, in open water, if you're just making a direct ascent, it's probably long enough to make a comfortable ascent. You can be face-to-face. But it's a lot more comfortable if you've got a little bit more distance between you, if you can maintain a horizontal trim while you do your ascent and safety stop and everything else. So that extra hose length is an advantage. You don't have to use all of it if you don't want to, but you have it there if you need to use it. Now, if you're wreck diving or you're cave diving, particularly if you're going through smaller areas, then that extra hose length becomes very important, so you can gas share single file. So I think sort of like having 2 intermediate length hoses, for me, that doesn't make any sense, to be honest.
Yep.
And then obviously, as I said, at the advanced side mount level, where, you know, a long hose isn't really going to be an advantage for you, now you really want to change your equipment configuration, but it's a very minor change. Okay, all you're doing is putting a short hose on. Pretty much everything else stays the same. And so in my equipment box, I basically have the same 2 regulators set up identically, but depending on what I'm doing, either I screw a long hose with a right-hand delivery second stage into that first stage, or I screw a short hose into that first stage with a left-hand delivery second stage. But it's, you know, very comparatively simple, quick and easy equipment change to make. And then I have the perfect equipment set up for the type of dive I'm doing and for the environment I'm diving in.
Yeah. So along with everything else, I mean, you were at the forefront of developing side mount training way back when, and I'm interested in how your views on side mount training have evolved since the early days.
My views and the training itself has evolved as the market has evolved. So when I was first offering side mount training, and this is going back to around about 2003, 2004, the only people I had coming to me to take side mount were experienced cave divers. Mm-hmm. So they're divers who already certified as full cave divers. They've obviously been diving quite a while in the cave. They've got a certain amount of experience, and now they want to do a crossover course to side mount, kind of like a specialty course. And at that time, there were no training agencies offering side mount apart from the cave diving organizations. So people like the NSSCDS or the NACD, and it was a specialty program beyond full cave. And so it was kind of like a 2-day crossover program, 2 or 3 day crossover program. You got someone in side mount equipment, and then that allowed them to get into areas of the cave that have been inaccessible to them in back mount. And to be honest, even in those early days, I found that a 2-day program, which was the standard, was a little bit too short to get all of the skills done and to have someone really comfortable in side mount, you know, before letting them loose in the cave. So most of my side mount courses at that time were 3 or 4 days long, and we usually did some diving afterwards as well. It was kind of more of a mentorship. Obviously, as side mount got more popular, And as Sidemount became more visible through social media and everything else, now we had people from different backgrounds wanting to get into Sidemount. So a lot of people were coming into Sidemount having never done any type of overhead environment training or even any type of technical training. So they were coming maybe just as an open water diver of some description. So now obviously the course has to focus on the equipment configuration itself and the skill to dive it comfortably and safely. And so that course morphed from sort of like a 2 or 3 day sort of like crossover program for people already cave certified into a program where it's almost like fundamentals for Sidemount. It's a basic Sidemount course that teaches you the equipment configuration, the skills and procedures needed to dive Sidemount safely. And that course becomes the foundation for all of the other courses that you're going to go on and take after that, whether they be in the overhead environment or the open water. And so that might involve technical diving, stage diving, diving with decompression cylinders, or advanced Sidemount diving, or any type of overhead environment training. So as I learned more about Sidemount and as the courses became more thorough, and as the skills that I realized people really needed actually increased, then the courses also became longer. And that's why they had to be split up, because otherwise it was too much information. I mean, I could take someone and spend 20 or 30 days teaching them everything I know about Sidemount, and we're not even going to get there in that period of time. But that's too much information. It's information overload. So you need to make the courses, you need to create bite-sized chunks that are easily digestible, and then people can go and gain some experience between courses, because that's very important. But they've been set on the right path. So that basic Sidemount course became like a 4 or 5 day module, and then beyond that you can go on and do other courses afterwards.
That sounds interesting. And we've already talked a little bit about your development of the Razor harness, but one thing I found interesting along with that was you developed the Razor instructor program as well, where you have a series of authorized instructors. Sort of talk me through a little bit the thinking behind having, because it's quite unique, I think. I don't know anyone else who does that in the Sidemount arena.
Well, I think, again, just as the equipment is holistic and each part works with every other, so then the training starts to mirror the equipment configuration to a certain extent. So because of the choices you've made with what equipment you're going to use and how you put it together, that also, to a certain extent, dictates how you're going to do certain skills, and those skills dictate how you're going to conduct certain procedures. So just as I was learning more about Sidemount diving through creating the Razor, I was also learning a lot more about how to teach Sidemount itself, and also what worked and what didn't work. So, before 2007, I'd already been diving Sidemount since, 1995. So that was sort of like, I'd been diving Sidemount for 12 years and felt that, I actually was a reasonable Sidemount diver. I knew quite a lot about Sidemount, or thought I did at the time. And then I went through an evolution over the next sort of 2 or 3 years where I pretty much wiped the slate clean and started all over again. And I learned so much more about Sidemount, and I became a much better Sidemount diver and became much more comfortable and wanted to be able to pass those ideas, skills, techniques onto my students. And obviously the start of that is the equipment, and how the equipment is set up, also all the skills and procedures and everything else. So out of that, there grew sort of like a training program, which was the Razor Basic Sidemount course. And obviously I started training people, and they liked the program a lot, and they wanted to get trained as instructors, because a lot of the people I had in the early days coming to me to take those courses, and still the case today, were already experienced instructors, so they wanted to go on and start teaching this stuff to their students. And it became clear that there wasn't really any standardization. Well, it was clear before that. There was no standardization in Sidemount, in equipment configuration, skills or procedures. And I felt there needed to be. I felt it made it much easier for the instructors to teach courses. I felt it made it much easier for the students to actually absorb the information and implement the information if there was a bit more structure in the equipment, the configuration, the skills, the procedures, and how everything was actually being taught. So it was something that I hadn't intended when I started out, but it's just a natural evolution or development of how things were going.
Well, that concludes part 1 of our interview with Steve Bogaerts. In our next episode, part 2, we'll explore cave diving with Steve, and we'll also talk Sidemount rebreathers. Look forward to having you join us in our next episode of Speaking Sidemount. You've been listening to Speaking Sidemount from www.sidemountpros.com. If you like the podcast, please subscribe and consider leaving us a 5-star review. If there's something you'd like us to cover on the show, then let us know via our Facebook page listed in the podcast notes. Thanks again, and we look forward to you joining us on our next episode of Speaking Sidemount.